The gunshot that killed Martha Nelson echoed through the thin walls of the boarding house, just as the sun broke over Eagle Pass, Texas, and Willa Nelson bolted upright in her bed, heart hammering against her ribs like a wild animal trying to escape. She pulled on her dress with shaking hands, not bothering with her corset as she rushed next door to the room where her neighbor had been bedridden for the past 3 weeks, coughing up blood and growing weaker by the day. But when Willa burst through the door, she found not violence but something far more wrenching. Martha lying still against sweat-soaked sheets, her chest no longer rising, her eyes fixed on nothing, and in the wooden cradle beside the bed, a tiny baby girl screaming with the fury of someone who had just lost everything. Willa stood frozen in the doorway, her mind unable to process what her eyes were telling her. The sound she had heard was not a gunshot after all but the violent slam of the shutter against the window frame, blown open by the fierce April wind that swept across the Texas plains. She moved slowly into the room, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else, and placed 2 fingers against Martha's neck, searching for a pulse she knew she would not find. The skin was already cooling. Martha had been only 22 years old, the same age as Willa herself, and now she was gone, leaving behind a 4-month-old baby girl with no father in sight and no family anyone knew of. The baby's cries grew more desperate, and Willa lifted the child from the cradle, holding her close and rocking gently back and forth. The little one quieted slightly, her red face pressing against Willa's shoulder, and Willa felt tears streaming down her own cheeks as she whispered soothing words that felt inadequate for the magnitude of this tragedy. Martha had arrived in Eagle Pass 6 months pregnant, claiming to be a widow, though Willa had suspected the truth was more complicated. They had become friends in the way that women living in adjacent rooms often did, sharing meals and conversation, and Martha had confided that she had named her daughter Rose after her own grandmother. Willa knew she needed to fetch the doctor and the undertaker, but she could not seem to make her feet move toward the door. Instead, she sank into the wooden chair beside Martha's bed, cradling Rose and trying to think through the fog of grief and shock. The boarding house was run by Mrs. Henderson, a stern woman with little patience for complications, and Willa knew that both she and the baby would be turned out if they could not pay Martha's back rent along with their own. Willa worked as a seamstress, taking in mending and making dresses for the few respectable women in town, but her earnings were meager, and she was already 3 weeks behind on her own rent. The sound of boots on the stairs pulled Willa from her thoughts, and Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her face grim. The older woman took in the scene with a single sweeping glance and crossed herself. "I heard the baby crying something fierce," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice softer than usual. "So she has passed then?" "Yes, madam. Just this morning, I think." "She is still warm." Willa tightened her arms protectively around Rose, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against her chest. Mrs. Henderson pressed her lips into a thin line. "I will send for Dr. Mitchell and the undertaker. The baby will have to go to the orphanage in San Antonio. There is no one here to care for her." "I can care for her," Willa heard herself saying, the words coming out before she had fully thought them through. "Martha was my friend. I can take Rose. And how do you propose to do that when you can barely pay your own rent, Mrs.?" Henderson's tone was not unkind, merely practical. "A baby needs food and clothing and constant attention. You cannot work with an infant on your hip." Willa knew the older woman was right, but the thought of sending Rose to an orphanage, where she would grow up without anyone who had known her mother, without anyone to tell her that Martha had loved her and had fought to survive long enough to bring her into the world safely, was unbearable. "I will find a way," Willa said firmly. "Please just give me a few days to sort things out." Mrs. Henderson studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have until the end of the week. If you cannot demonstrate that you can provide for both yourself and the child by then, she goes to San Antonio. Do you understand?" "Yes, madam. Thank you." Willa blinked back fresh tears as Mrs. Henderson left to make the necessary arrangements. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Dr. Mitchell arrived to officially pronounce Martha dead and determined that her consumption had finally claimed her. The undertaker came and took the body away, and Willa learned that Martha had no money saved, nothing of value except a small gold locket that Willa tucked away to give to Rose when she was older. Several women from the boarding house brought food and clean linens, and one brought a basket of baby clothes that her own children had outgrown. Willa was grateful for the kindness, but she could see the pity in their eyes and knew they did not believe she could manage to keep Rose. That evening, as Willa sat in her own small room trying to feed Rose with a cloth soaked in milk, she calculated her finances with growing desperation. She had exactly $4.30 to her name. Her rent was $2 per week, and she would need milk and cloths and all manner of supplies for the baby. Even if she worked every waking hour, she could not earn enough to support them both, not when she would have to stop constantly to tend to Rose. The baby was fussing, struggling to get enough milk from the makeshift arrangement, and Willa felt her own frustration rising. She had no experience with infants and no idea what she was doing. Rose began to cry in earnest, her tiny face scrunching up in misery, and Willa stood to walk with her, bouncing gently and singing a lullaby her own mother had sung years ago, before the fever had taken both her parents and left Willa alone in the world at 16. A knock at the door startled them both, and Rose's cries intensified. Willa called out permission to enter, expecting Mrs. Henderson or perhaps one of the other boarders, but instead a tall man in dusty trail clothes stepped into the room, removing his hat as he did so. Willa recognized him as one of the cowboys who worked at the Anderson Ranch just outside town. She had seen him occasionally at the general store, and Martha had mentioned once that he had been kind to her, helping her carry packages when her pregnancy had made movement difficult. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Nelson. My name is Samuel Ashford. I heard about Martha passing and I wanted to pay my respects." His voice was deep and gentle, and his eyes, a warm brown that reminded Willa of honey in sunlight, were filled with genuine sorrow. "That is kind of you, Mr. Ashford. I am afraid the service will be tomorrow morning if you wish to attend." Willa shifted Rose to her other shoulder, trying unsuccessfully to quiet the baby's wails. Samuel took a step closer, his weathered face creasing with concern. "She sounds hungry. Do you have a proper bottle for her?" "No, I have been trying to use cloth soaked in milk, but she cannot seem to get enough." Willa felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment at admitting her inadequacy. "May I?" Samuel held out his hands, and after a moment's hesitation, Willa passed Rose to him. The big cowboy cradled the tiny baby with surprising tenderness, and Willa noticed that his hands, though rough and calloused, were gentle as he examined Rose's face. "She is a pretty little thing, looks like her mother." He glanced up at Willa. "I heard that you are planning to keep her." "I am going to try, though I confess I have no idea how I will manage it." Willa's voice broke slightly, and she turned away to compose herself. Samuel was quiet for a moment, swaying slightly with Rose, who had calmed somewhat at the change in handlers. When he spoke again, his words were slow and measured, as though he was thinking through each one carefully. "Miss Nelson, I realize this is going to sound strange and I do not want to offend you or cause you distress, but I have a proposition that might help both you and this baby." Willa turned back to face him, wariness mixing with curiosity. "What kind of proposition? Let me raise this child with you. As partners, I mean. We could marry, in name at least, and I could provide for you both. I have steady work and a small house on the Anderson property. It is not much, but it is clean and sturdy, and there would be room for all of us." He spoke matter-of-factly, as though he were discussing the weather rather than proposing marriage to a woman he barely knew. Willa stared at him, certain she must have misheard. "You want to marry me? You do not even know me. I know that you are a good woman who cared for her friend, and is now willing to sacrifice everything to honor that friendship by caring for her child. I know that Martha spoke highly of you, said you were the only person in this town who did not judge her for her circumstances." Samuel shifted Rose to rest against his broad chest, and the baby's eyes began to drift closed. "And I know that I made a promise to Martha." "What promise?" Willa's voice was barely above a whisper. "About 3 weeks ago, when it became clear she was not going to recover, Martha asked me to check in on you and Rose after she was gone. She was worried about what would become of her daughter. I told her I would do what I could to help." Samuel met Willa's eyes steadily. "I did not expect to show up here proposing marriage, but when I heard you were planning to keep Rose, it seemed like the most practical solution. You need money and support, and I need—" He trailed off, looking down at the sleeping baby. "What do you need, Mr. Ashford?" Willa asked softly. "A purpose, I suppose. I am 30 years old, and I have spent the last 12 years drifting from ranch to ranch, doing work that needs doing but never really building anything that lasts. I have been thinking lately that I would like to have a family, a home, something more than just a bunk and a bedroll. This little girl needs parents, and we could give her that if you are willing." The proposal was insane, and Willa knew she should refuse immediately. But as she watched Samuel hold Rose with such care, as she thought about the alternative of sending the baby to an orphanage or watching them both be turned out onto the street, she found herself actually considering it. "You said a marriage in name. What exactly do you mean by that?" "I mean we would be legally married, and I would provide for you and Rose financially. But I would not expect anything else from you unless you wanted it. You would have your own room, your own space. I am not looking to force any woman into something she does not want." Samuel's voice was firm and sincere. "And if I said yes, when would this marriage take place?" Willa could hardly believe she was asking, but she needed to understand the full scope of what he was suggesting. "As soon as possible. Tomorrow, after Martha's funeral, if you are agreeable. The circuit judge is in town for another 2 days, and I already spoke with him about the possibility. I wanted to have a concrete solution to offer you before I came here." Samuel finally looked slightly uncomfortable, as though he realized how presumptuous this might sound. Willa crossed to the window and looked out at the dusty main street of Eagle Pass. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and she could see people going about their evening routines, unaware that her entire life was balanced on the edge of a decision she had to make in the next few moments. She thought about Martha, who had been brave enough to leave wherever she had come from to try to build a new life for herself and her baby. She thought about Rose, who deserved to grow up with people who cared about her, who would keep her mother's memory alive. And she thought about Samuel Ashford, a man she barely knew but who had shown more kindness in the past half hour than many people showed in a lifetime. "If I agree to this, I need to know that you will not change the terms later. That you will not expect me to be a real wife in all ways just because we share a house." Willa kept her back to him, unable to look at his face as she spoke about such delicate matters. "You have my word on that, Miss Nelson. I am a man of my word, and I do not take that lightly." There was steel beneath the gentleness in his voice now, and Willa believed him. She turned to face him, squaring her shoulders. "Then yes, Mr. Ashford, I will marry you and we will raise Rose together." A slow smile spread across Samuel's face, transforming his serious features and making him look younger. "Call me Samuel, please. I figure if we are going to be married, we should use given names. Then you must call me Willa." She found herself returning his smile, feeling a flutter of something that might have been hope in her chest for the first time since she had found Martha that morning. Samuel stood carefully, still cradling Rose, and extended his free hand to Willa. She took it, feeling the calluses and the strength in his grip, and they shook on the agreement like business partners sealing a deal. Except, this was no ordinary business arrangement. This was her life, Rose's life, and she was entrusting it all to a cowboy who had walked into her room less than an hour ago with an impossible proposition. "I should go and make arrangements for tomorrow. I will need to speak with Mr. Anderson about bringing you and Rose to the house, and I will need to buy a proper cradle and some supplies." Samuel reluctantly handed Rose back to Willa, and the baby stirred but did not wake. "Is there anything specific you need me to get?" Willa rattled off a list of baby essentials, trying to think of everything they would require in the coming days. Samuel listened carefully, nodding, and she was struck by how seriously he was taking all of this. He was not treating it as some impulsive gesture he would regret in the morning. He was already planning, already thinking ahead, and that gave her a measure of comfort. After Samuel left, Willa sat in her chair with Rose sleeping peacefully now, her tiny hand curled around Willa's finger, and tried to process everything that had just happened. Tomorrow she would bury her friend, and then she would marry a stranger and move to a house she had never seen to begin a life she could never have imagined. It was terrifying and overwhelming, and yet there was a small voice in the back of her mind whispering that perhaps, just perhaps, this was exactly what was meant to happen. The next morning dawned clear and warm, the kind of spring day that seemed at odds with the somber task ahead. Martha's funeral was held in the small cemetery at the edge of town, attended by a handful of people from the boarding house and a few others who had known her slightly. Samuel stood beside Willa throughout the brief service, holding Rose so that Willa could grieve properly, and his quiet presence was more comforting than she would have expected. When it came time to lower the simple pine coffin into the ground, Willa placed a handful of wildflowers on top, purple and yellow blooms she had picked that morning, and whispered a final goodbye to her friend. After the service, Samuel drove Willa and Rose to the small church where the circuit judge was waiting to perform the marriage ceremony. Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Mitchell came along to serve as witnesses, both looking somewhat bewildered by the rapid turn of events, but willing to support what they saw as a practical solution to a difficult situation. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, with no flowers or music or any of the trappings Willa had once imagined for her wedding day. She wore her best dress, a dark blue calico that she had made herself, and Samuel had cleaned up and changed into clothes that were not covered in trail dust. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel leaned down and pressed a chaste kiss to Willa's forehead, careful and respectful, and she felt her eyes sting with tears she could not quite name. They signed the marriage certificate, and just like that, Willa Nelson became Willa Ashford, and Rose gained two parents who were committed to giving her the best life they could manage. The house Samuel had mentioned was about 2 miles outside of Eagle Pass, a small structure made of adobe with a wooden shingle roof and a covered porch that faced east to catch the morning sun. It was indeed modest, but as Samuel carried their belongings inside, Willa could see that he had been truthful about it being clean and well maintained. There were 2 bedrooms, A main living area with a fireplace and a small kitchen space, and even a proper floor made of wooden planks rather than just packed dirt. Samuel had already set up a cradle in the smaller bedroom, which he indicated would be Willa's room with Rose, and his own bedroom was on the opposite side of the house. I brought some basic supplies, but I figure you will want to arrange things how you like them. The kitchen is yours to organize as you see fit. Samuel set down the trunk that contained Willa's possessions and looked around as though seeing the place through her eyes. It is not fancy, but it is solid, and the roof does not leak. It is lovely, Willa said honestly. After years of living in a single rented room, the idea of having an entire house, even a small one, felt like unimaginable luxury. Thank you for preparing it for us. Samuel ducked his head, looking pleased. I will need to get back to work soon. Mr. Anderson was understanding about me taking the morning off, but there is still work to be done. Will you be all right here on your own with Rose? Yes, of course. We will be fine. Willa was already mentally cataloging all the things she wanted to do to make the house feel more like a home. True to his word, Samuel left within the hour, riding off on his sturdy bay horse toward the main ranch buildings that were visible in the distance. Willa spent the rest of the day unpacking her things, exploring the house, and caring for Rose. She found that Samuel had bought far more supplies than she had requested, including a proper baby bottle, several yards of soft cloth for diapers and gowns, and a beautiful wooden rocking chair that sat in the corner of her bedroom. There was also food in the kitchen, staples like flour and beans and coffee, as well as fresh milk and eggs and even a small jar of honey. As evening approached, Willa sat in the rocking chair with Rose, feeding the baby with the new bottle and watching the sunset through the window. Rose took to the bottle much better than the cloth, drinking eagerly and then falling asleep with a contented expression that made Willa's heart clench. She laid the baby in the cradle and covered her with a soft blanket, then went to the kitchen to prepare something for dinner. Samuel returned just as full dark fell, looking tired but satisfied. He washed up at the basin Willa had set out and joined her at the small table where she had laid out plates of beans and cornbread. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Samuel spoke. "How was your first day here?" he asked, his eyes curious but not intrusive. "Good. The house is wonderful and Rose seemed to settle in well. She took to the bottle right away." Willa paused, then added, "Thank you for all the supplies. You bought far more than you needed to." "I wanted to make sure you had everything." Samuel took a sip of his coffee. "Tomorrow I will show you around the property, where the well is and where the root cellar is, things like that. And I was thinking, if you wanted to continue your sewing work, you could set up in the main room near the window where the light is good. I do not want you to feel like you have to give that up just because I am providing for us." His consideration surprised her. Most men, she knew, would have expected their wives to focus solely on domestic duties, but Samuel seemed to understand that her work was important to her beyond just the money it brought in. "I would like that, though I imagine Rose will keep me busy enough for a while." "Babies have a way of doing that," Samuel agreed, a hint of amusement in his voice. Then his expression grew more serious. "Willa, I know this is all strange and happening very fast. I just want you to know that I meant what I said yesterday. You are safe here, and I will do everything I can to make sure you and Rose have what you need." Something in his earnestness made Willa's throat tighten. "I believe you," she said softly, "and I will do my part as well. I know how to keep a house and cook, and I will make sure this is a proper home for all of us." They finished their meal, and Samuel helped her clean up, which surprised her again. Then he excused himself to his own room, bidding her good night with that same careful courtesy he had shown from the beginning. Willa checked on Rose one more time, then changed into her nightgown and climbed into the narrow bed. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling and the wind rustling through the mesquite trees outside, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 2 days. She had gone from a struggling seamstress with no prospects to a married woman with a home and a baby to care for. It did not feel real yet, but she was determined to make the best of it, for Rose's sake if nothing else. The following weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Willa with its naturalness. Samuel left early each morning for work at the ranch, usually before dawn, and returned in the evening tired and dusty, but always with a smile for her and Rose. Willa spent her days caring for the baby, keeping the house, and gradually resuming her sewing work. Samuel had spread the word that she was available for mending and dressmaking, and soon she had a steady stream of customers coming to the house. She appreciated the income, modest though it was, and even more she appreciated having adult conversation during her days. Rose was thriving, growing plumper and more alert with each passing week. She began to smile, first just random expressions and then real social smiles that lit up her entire face. Willa found herself falling completely in love with the little girl, spending hours talking to her and singing to her and marveling at every small development. Samuel, too, seemed enchanted by Rose, and Willa often found him holding the baby in the evenings, talking to her in a low voice about his day or telling her stories about the horses he worked with. One evening about a month after their marriage, Willa and Samuel were sitting on the porch after dinner, enjoying the cooler air. Rose was asleep in Samuel's arms, her head resting on his shoulder, and Willa was mending a shirt by the light of the lantern Samuel had hung from a hook. "She is getting so big already," Samuel observed, adjusting Rose slightly to make sure she was comfortable. "I know. It seems like just yesterday she was crying all the time and barely eating. Now she is all smiles and chatter." Willa nodded off her thread and snipped it, then looked up at Samuel. "You are very good with her, you know. She adores you." Samuel looked pleased at this assessment. "She is an easy baby to love. Martha would be happy to see how well she is doing." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I think she would be happy to see how well you are doing too. You have really made this place into a home." Willa felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Over the past weeks, she had come to realize that Samuel was one of the most genuinely kind men she had ever met. He never spoke harshly, never complained even when he was clearly exhausted, and treated her with a respect and consideration that she had not known she was missing. She found herself looking forward to his return each evening, enjoying their conversations over dinner, and feeling a sense of contentment she had not experienced in years. "Can I ask you something?" Willa set aside her mending and turned to face him more fully. "Of course." "Why did you really propose this arrangement? I understand wanting to help, but this is your whole life. You have changed. You could have just given me some money or helped me find work. You did not have to marry me." She had been wondering about this since the beginning, trying to understand his motivations beyond the surface explanation he had given. Samuel was silent for a long time, his hand absently stroking Rose's back as he stared out at the darkening landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "I told you I wanted a family, a purpose, and that was true. But I suppose the fuller truth is that I was lonely. I have spent most of my adult life alone, working hard but never really connecting with anyone. When Martha asked me to look after you and Rose, it felt like I was being given a chance to be part of something bigger than just myself. And when I met you, when I saw how determined you were to keep Rose even though it would have been easier to give her up, I knew I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to help build the kind of life where a little girl could grow up knowing she was loved and wanted. His honesty touched something deep inside Willa, and she found herself blinking back tears. "I was lonely too," she admitted. "I have been since my parents died 6 years ago. I had Martha for a little while, but mostly I have just been going through the motions, existing rather than living. This past month has been the first time in a long while that I have felt like I actually have a purpose beyond just surviving until the next day." Samuel met her eyes, and in the golden lamplight, his expression was gentle and understanding. "Then I am glad we found each other, even if the circumstances were not what either of us would have chosen." "So am I," Willa said softly, and she meant it with her whole heart. As spring turned to summer, the bond between Willa and Samuel continued to deepen. They worked together to plant a small vegetable garden behind the house, with Samuel doing the heavy digging and Willa planting seeds and planning the layout. Rose spent these sessions lying on a blanket in the shade, watching them with bright, curious eyes and waving her fists in the air. The garden flourished in the Texas heat, providing them with fresh tomatoes, beans, squash, and peppers that Willa used to make meals far more varied than the simple fare they had started with. Samuel began teaching Willa to ride, something she had never learned despite living in Texas for years. He was patient and encouraging as she struggled to learn the basics, never making her feel foolish for her inexperience. She appreciated his teaching style, which was gentle but firm, and she found herself actually enjoying the lessons despite her initial nervousness. They would ride out in the early mornings before the heat became too intense, with Rose secured in a sling against Willa's chest, and Samuel would point out various landmarks and tell her stories about the area. It was on one of these morning rides that they encountered trouble for the first time. They were perhaps 3 miles from the house when Samuel suddenly tensed and reached for the rifle he kept strapped to his saddle. Willa followed his gaze and saw 3 rough-looking men on horseback approaching from the east. She tightened her arms protectively around Rose and waited, her heart pounding as the men drew closer. "Morning," Samuel called out, his voice level but his body language alert and ready. The lead man, a grizzled individual with a scar across his cheek, looked them over with calculating eyes. "Morning. That is a nice horse you have got there, friend. Fine saddle, too." "They are not for sale," Samuel replied calmly. "Is there something I can help you gentlemen with?" "Well, we are a bit short on supplies, and we thought maybe you could spare some food or water." The man's tone was casual, but Willa could sense the threat underneath it. "I am afraid we do not have any supplies with us, but if you ride into Eagle Pass, you can get what you need at the general store." Samuel shifted slightly, positioning himself between Willa and the strangers. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "Now, that is not very neighborly of you. Here we are asking nicely, and you are sending us away empty-handed." His companion spread out slightly, a clear tactical move. Samuel's voice took on an edge of steel that Willa had never heard before. "I said no. I suggest you move along before there is trouble." For a tense moment, Willa thought the men might try something. She could feel Rose beginning to fuss, sensing the tension, and she pressed her hand gently over the baby's back, trying to keep her calm. Then one of the other men spoke up. "Hey, is not that Sam Ashford? He rides for the Anderson Ranch." The scarred man peered more closely at Samuel, then his expression shifted to something more wary. "Ashford, you are the one who shot it out with the Carter gang last year." "I am the one who defended Mr. Anderson's property when the Carter gang tried to rustle his cattle. Yes." Samuel's tone remained calm but unwavering. The men exchanged glances, and Willa could see them reassessing the situation. The scarred man finally nodded slowly. "All right then, we will be on our way. Did not mean any offense." They turned their horses and rode off at a canter, leaving Willa and Samuel alone again. Willa released a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Are you really the man who fought the Carter gang?" Samuel relaxed slightly and urged his horse forward again, Willa's mount following. It was not as dramatic as it sounds. They tried to steal cattle in the middle of the night, and I happened to be on watch. I fired some warning shots and they fled. One of them took a bullet in the shoulder, but that was all. The story has grown in the telling. Still, that was very brave. Willa looked at him with new appreciation. She had known Samuel was competent and reliable, but she had not fully grasped that he might also be formidable when necessary. "It was my job," Samuel said simply. "Just like keeping you and Rose safe is my job now. Those men will not bother us again, but I think we should stick closer to home for a while, just to be cautious." They rode back to the house in silence, but Willa found herself thinking about what had just happened. Samuel had protected them without hesitation, had faced down 3 men without showing fear, and had done it all while making sure she and Rose stayed safe. It was one thing to appreciate his kindness and his work ethic, but this was something deeper. This was the kind of man who would stand between his family and danger without a second thought. That evening, after Rose was asleep and they had finished dinner, Willa brought up the incident again. "Thank you for protecting us today. I realize I did not say that earlier, but I should have." Samuel looked up from the coffee he was drinking, surprise evident on his face. "You do not need to thank me for that. It is what any decent man would do. Maybe, but you did it, and I am grateful." Willa hesitated, then added, "I have been thinking about what you said when you first proposed this arrangement, about how it would be a marriage in name only. And I have been wondering if perhaps we should reconsider that." Samuel went very still, his eyes searching her face. "What exactly are you saying?" Willa felt her cheeks flush, but she pressed on. "I am saying that over these past months I have come to care for you, more than I expected to, more than I thought was possible with someone I had known for such a short time. You have been nothing but kind and respectful and good to both me and Rose, and I find myself wanting this to be a real marriage in every sense of the word, if you are willing." The silence stretched between them, and for a horrible moment, Willa thought she had misread everything, that he did not feel the same way and she had just ruined the comfortable partnership they had built. But then, Samuel stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. "Willa, I have been half in love with you since the first week we were married. I did not say anything because I did not want to pressure you or make you uncomfortable. I meant what I said about not expecting anything from you, and I would have been content to keep things as they were if that was what you wanted. But if you are saying what I think you are saying, then yes, I am very much willing." His voice was rough with emotion, and his eyes were shining. Willa reached out and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the rasp of his evening stubble against her palms. "I am saying that I love you, Samuel Ashford. I love the way you talk to Rose like she is a real person. I love how you always ask about my day and actually listen to the answer. I love how hard you work to provide for us, and how you never make me feel like I am a burden. I love you, and I want to be your wife in truth." Samuel closed the distance between them and kissed her, soft and sweet, and full of all the emotion he had been holding back for months. Willa melted into it, her hands sliding into his hair, and felt a profound sense of rightness wash over her. This was where she was meant to be with this man, building this life. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard and smiling. "I love you too," Samuel said, resting his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to say that for so long." They stayed like that for a long moment, savoring the new understanding between them, and then Samuel stood and offered her his hand. Willa took it and let him pull her to her feet, And together they walked to his bedroom, which would now become their bedroom, ready to begin the next chapter of their marriage. The physical aspect of their relationship unfolded naturally over the following weeks, with both of them learning what brought the other pleasure. And Willa discovered that Samuel was as considerate and patient in this area as he was in every other part of their life together. She had been nervous at first, her limited experience leaving her uncertain, but Samuel had guided her gently and made sure she always felt safe and cherished. Their bond deepened in ways she had not anticipated, and she found herself falling more in love with him every day. Rose continued to grow and develop, and by the time she was 8 months old, she was sitting up on her own and beginning to experiment with crawling. Willa and Samuel would sit on the floor with her in the evenings, encouraging her efforts and laughing at her determined expressions as she worked to master this new skill. Samuel proved to be an endlessly patient father figure, never showing frustration when Rose knocked over his carefully built towers of blocks or grabbed at his hair with her surprisingly strong baby fists. One evening in late August, Samuel came home from work with an unusual expression on his face, something between excitement and nervousness. Willa was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew, and she turned to look at him curiously. "What is it? Did something happen?" she asked, setting down her spoon. Samuel removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign that he was trying to figure out how to say something. "Mr. Anderson called me into his office today. He is getting too old to manage the entire ranch operation himself, and he wants to promote me to foreman." Willa felt a surge of pride and excitement. "Samuel, that is wonderful. You absolutely deserve it. The thing is, it comes with more responsibility, longer hours sometimes, but also significantly better pay. And there is a larger house that goes with the position, a real ranch house with 4 bedrooms and a proper barn. He wants us to move into it within the month." Samuel watched her carefully, clearly uncertain how she would react to this news. Willa moved toward him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. "I am so proud of you, and of course we will move. This house has been perfect for us, but more space would be wonderful, especially as Rose gets bigger and starts running around." She felt Samuel relax and return her embrace, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I was worried you might not want to leave here. I know you have put a lot of work into making this place home." "Home is wherever we are together," Willa said simply, looking up at him. "The 3 of us, that is what matters. The house is just a structure." Samuel's eyes softened with love, and he kissed her properly, deep and thorough, until they both heard Rose beginning to babble from her cradle, demanding attention. They broke apart laughing, and Samuel went to pick up the baby while Willa finished preparing dinner. The move to the new house happened 3 weeks later, and Willa was amazed at the difference in their living situation. The house was not grand by any means, but it was spacious and well built, with windows that let in plenty of light and a kitchen large enough for a proper work table. There was a separate room that Willa could use for her sewing, and Rose would have her own bedroom once she was old enough to sleep separately. The barn would allow Samuel to keep his own horses rather than relying on the ranch stock, and there was even a small chicken coop that came with a dozen laying hens. Samuel's new position kept him busy, but he seemed energized rather than exhausted by the additional responsibility. He would come home and tell Willa about the decisions he had made that day, asking her opinion on various matters, and she appreciated being included in his work life in this way. She could see that the other ranch hands respected him, and Mr. Anderson frequently praised his judgment and leadership. As autumn arrived and Rose celebrated her first birthday with a small cake Willa had baked, Life felt almost too perfect. Willa sometimes worried that something would happen to disrupt their happiness, but Samuel would remind her that they had built this life together through hard work and commitment, and they deserved to enjoy it. Rose was walking now, toddling around the house with determination and getting into everything, and both Willa and Samuel delighted in her antics. It was in November that Willa began to suspect she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses had not come, and she was experiencing the same morning queasiness she remembered Martha describing. She waited until she was certain before telling Samuel, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. When she finally shared the news one evening as they were getting ready for bed, his reaction was everything she could have wanted. Truly, we are going to have a baby. Samuel's face lit up with joy, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break. Truly. I think the baby will come sometime in late June or early July. Willa laughed at his expression, which cycled rapidly through excitement, pride, and then worry. Are you feeling all right? Do you need to see the doctor? Should you be resting more? Samuel fired off questions, his protective instincts in full force. I am fine, and yes, I will see Dr. Mitchell next time we are in town. But women have been having babies since the beginning of time, and I am healthy and strong. Everything will be fine. Willa cupped his face and kissed him gently. Are you happy about this? Happy does not begin to cover it, Samuel said fervently. I know Rose is not my blood, but I love her like she is my own daughter, and now we are going to have another child, one that we created together. It feels like a miracle. They held each other for a long time, both processing this new development and all it would mean for their family. Willa thought about Martha and wished her friend could know that Rose would soon have a sibling, that the little girl was growing up in a home filled with love and security. She felt a bittersweet pang of grief mixed with gratitude, knowing that Martha's tragedy had somehow led to her own profound happiness. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, with Willa experiencing relatively mild discomfort compared to some of the stories she had heard. Samuel was attentive to the point of being slightly overbearing, constantly asking if she needed anything and trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work. Willa appreciated his concern, but also had to gently remind him that she was not fragile and needed to stay active. They compromised, with Samuel taking over the most strenuous tasks while allowing Willa to continue her normal routines. Rose seemed to sense that something was different, and she became more clingy and affectionate as the months passed. Willa would sit with the little girl and explain that she was going to be a big sister, though Rose was far too young to truly understand. Samuel built a new cradle for the coming baby, spending his evenings in the barn crafting it from smooth pine and carving delicate designs into the headboard. Willa would bring him coffee and sit with him, watching his skilled hands shape the wood, and feel overwhelmed with love for this man who had become her entire world. In late June, as the Texas heat became almost unbearable, Willa went into labor. Samuel fetched Dr. Mitchell, and then paced the house anxiously while Willa labored with the help of the doctor and Mrs. Henderson, who had ridden out from town to assist. Rose was being watched by one of the ranch hands' wives, keeping her away from the intensity of the birth. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following morning, and there were moments when Willa thought she could not endure another contraction. But finally, as the sun climbed high in the sky, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy with a shock of dark hair and a powerful set of lungs. Dr. Mitchell placed the baby in her arms, and Willa counted his fingers and toes through tears of exhaustion and joy. Samuel was allowed into the room once Willa was cleaned up, and the baby was wrapped in a soft blanket. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep and worry, but his face transformed when he saw his son for the first time. He approached the bed slowly, reverently, and looked down at the tiny person they had created. "He is perfect," Samuel whispered, reaching out to gently touch the baby's cheek. "Absolutely perfect." "We need to choose a name," Willa said, shifting to make room for Samuel to sit beside her on the bed. They had discussed names over the past months but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, Samuel said, "What about James? James Samuel Ashford. I had a brother named James who died when I was young, and I would like to honor his memory. James is a good, strong name. I think it suits him." Willa smiled up at her husband and saw the sheen of tears in his eyes. "Thank you," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for this gift, for our son, for everything you have given me." "We gave this to each other," Willa corrected gently, "and we will raise him together just like we are raising Rose, our family." Samuel leaned down and kissed her forehead, then pressed a gentle kiss to baby James's head. They sat together like that, the three of them, until Dr. Mitchell insisted that Willa needed to rest and shooed Samuel out of the room. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and constant baby care, but Samuel stepped up in every way possible. He would take James in the early morning hours, so Willa could get a few hours of uninterrupted sleep, and he would walk with the baby when James was fussy in the evenings. Rose adjusted to having a new sibling with typical toddler unpredictability, sometimes showing great interest in the baby and other times seeming resentful of the attention he received. Willa and Samuel worked to make sure Rose still felt loved and important, including her in baby care as much as possible and setting aside special time just for her. As summer turned to fall, and James grew into a chubby, happy infant, life settled into a new rhythm. Willa had to reduce her sewing work significantly to manage two small children, but Samuel's income as foreman was sufficient to support the family comfortably. They were not wealthy by any means, but they had enough, and more importantly, they had each other. One October evening, after both children were asleep and Samuel and Willa were sitting on the porch enjoying the cooler air, Samuel reached over and took Willa's hand. "Do you ever think about how we started? How all of this came about because of tragedy?" Willa squeezed his hand and nodded. "I think about Martha often, about how she would be so happy to see Rose thriving, to know that her daughter is loved and has a family. I wish she could be here to see it. I wish that too, but I think she knows somehow. And I think she would be glad that her death led to something good, to our family." Samuel was quiet for a moment, then added, "I know I should not say this, but I cannot help being grateful for how things turned out. I hate that Martha died, and I hate that Rose lost her mother. But if those things had not happened, you and I would never have found each other. Does that make me a terrible person? No, it makes you human. I feel the same way." Willa leaned her head on his shoulder. "We can be grateful for what we have while still grieving what was lost. Those things can exist together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Willa reflected on the past year and a half, on how completely her life had been transformed. She had gone from lonely and struggling to having a husband she loved deeply, 2 beautiful children, and a home that felt like everything she had ever wanted. The path to this happiness had been paved with loss and grief, but somehow that made it even more precious. She and Samuel had chosen each other, had chosen to build this life together, and that choice had made all the difference. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters when food was scarce and money was tight. There were illnesses that frightened them, including a bout of scarlet fever that swept through the area when Rose was 4, and left them terrified they would lose her. There were droughts that stressed the ranch and made Samuel's job more difficult. And there were times when Willa felt overwhelmed by the demands of managing a household and caring for two active children. But through it all, Willa and Samuel's love for each other only grew stronger. They had built their marriage on a foundation of respect, partnership, and genuine affection, and that foundation proved unshakable. They learned to communicate through difficulties, to support each other through stress, and to celebrate the small victories that made up their daily life. Rose grew into a bright, curious child with her mother's delicate features, and a spirit that was entirely her own. Willa made sure to tell Rose about Martha, showing her the gold locket and sharing stories about the brave young woman who had loved her daughter enough to hold on until she was safely born. Rose called Samuel Papa, without any confusion or hesitation, accepting him as her father in every way that mattered. And Samuel never treated her any differently than he would have a biological child. James developed into a sturdy boy with Samuel's brown eyes and Willa's smile, full of energy and mischief. He and Rose were close despite their age difference, and watching them play together filled Willa with contentment. She would often pause in her work to simply observe her children, marveling at the fact that she got to be their mother. When Rose turned 6, she started attending the small school in Eagle Pass, riding in with Samuel in the morning and returning in the afternoon. She proved to be an excellent student, quick with numbers and letters, and her teacher frequently commented on her intelligence and sweet nature. Willa was proud of her daughter and made sure Rose knew it, encouraging her curiosity and her love of learning. In the spring of 1876, when Rose was nearly 7 and James was approaching his 3rd birthday, Willa discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, with more severe morning sickness and more fatigue, but she was also more experienced and knew what to expect. Samuel was just as protective and attentive as he had been the first time, perhaps even more so given the increased difficulty Willa was experiencing. Their daughter was born in December, a week before Christmas, after a mercifully short labor that had Dr. Mitchell commenting on how much easier second births often were for women. They named her Margaret Ann, after both of Willa's mother and Samuel's mother, and from the moment she entered the world, she proved to have a personality all her own. Where James had been a relatively calm baby, Margaret was demanding and opinionated, crying lustily when she wanted something and smiling beatifically when she got it. Rose was enchanted with her baby sister, wanting to help with everything and constantly asking to hold Margaret. James was less interested, viewing the new baby as competition for attention, but he gradually warmed to her as the months passed, and Margaret began to show more personality. Willa found managing 3 children to be exponentially more challenging than 2, but she also found new depths of love she had not known she possessed. The house that had seemed so spacious when they moved in now felt comfortably full, with the sounds of children's laughter and occasional arguments filling the rooms. Willa's sewing work had been set aside almost entirely, but she did not miss it as much as she thought she would. Her children were her work now, and while it was exhausting and sometimes frustrating, it was also deeply fulfilling. Samuel thrived in his role as foreman, earning the respect of both Mr. Anderson and the ranch hands who worked under him. He had a gift for leadership, knowing when to be firm and when to show flexibility, and the ranch prospered under his management. Mr. Anderson, who had no children of his own, began to hint that, when he eventually retired, he would want Samuel to take over full management of the operation, a prospect that both excited and daunted Samuel. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, Willa and Samuel would sit together and talk about their days, their dreams, their plans for the future. These conversations were Willa's favorite part of the day, the quiet intimacy of sharing thoughts and feelings with someone who truly understood her. She sometimes thought back to that desperate morning when she had found Martha dead and wondered at how life could change so completely and unexpectedly. "You ever regret it?" she asked Samuel one night, about 5 years into their marriage. "Taking on a wife and baby you did not know, changing your whole life in the space of a day." Samuel looked at her with such tenderness that Willa felt her breath catch. "Not for a single moment. You and the children are the best thing that ever happened to me. I was just existing before, going through the motions. You gave me a reason to build something lasting, to be better than I was. If I could go back to that day, I would make the same choice without hesitation." Even knowing how much work 3 children would turn out to be, Willa teased gently. "Especially knowing that," Samuel said firmly. "Every sleepless night, every worry, every challenge has been worth it. We have built something real here, Willa. A family, a home, a life worth living. That is more than most people ever get." Willa moved to sit in his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck and resting her head against his shoulder. "I love you so much. Sometimes I feel like my heart is going to burst from it." "I know the feeling," Samuel murmured, his arms tightening around her. "I love you too, more than I have words to express." They sat like that for a long time, holding each other in the quiet of the night, grateful for everything they had found together. As the children grew, the Ashford household became known throughout Eagle Pass and the surrounding area as a warm, welcoming place. Willa frequently had other women visiting for tea and conversation, and Samuel often had ranch hands stopping by to discuss work or simply to enjoy the lively atmosphere. The family attended church most Sundays, sitting together in their pew and singing hymns with varying degrees of skill and enthusiasm. Rose continued to excel in school and developed a particular love for reading, devouring every book she could get her hands on. Samuel built her a small bookshelf for her birthday one year, and slowly they filled it with volumes purchased from traveling merchants or borrowed from the few families in the area who owned books. Willa loved watching Rose curl up in the corner with a book, so absorbed in the story that she would not hear when Willa called her name. James showed an early aptitude for working with animals, particularly horses. By the time he was 5, he was already spending time in the barn with Samuel, learning how to groom and care for the horses, and Samuel began teaching him basic riding skills. James was fearless in a way that sometimes terrified Willa, but Samuel assured her that this boldness would serve him well as he grew older, and he was careful to teach the boy proper safety and respect for the animals. Margaret, the baby of the family, proved to be as bright and determined as her older siblings. She talked early and walked early, always trying to keep up with Rose and James despite being years younger. She had Samuel's dark hair and Willa's green eyes, and a smile that could convince anyone to give her what she wanted. Willa recognized that Margaret would need careful guidance to ensure her strong will was channeled productively, but she also appreciated her daughter's spirit and independence. In the summer of 1879, when Rose was 10, James was 6, and Margaret was 3, Mr. Anderson passed away peacefully in his sleep. He had been declining for the past year, his age finally catching up with him, and while his death was not unexpected, it still hit the community hard. He had been a fixture in Eagle Pass for decades, and many people owed their livelihoods to the ranch he had built. As expected, Mr. Anderson's will named Samuel as the primary beneficiary of the ranch, with the understanding that he would continue to run it and provide for the ranch hands who depended on it for employment. Samuel was overwhelmed by the responsibility and the trust that had been placed in him. But he was also determined to honor Mr. Anderson's legacy and his faith in Samuel's abilities. The change in their circumstances was significant. They were no longer employees but landowners, responsible for thousands of acres and dozens of cattle. The financial implications were enormous, and while it would take time for them to fully understand their new situation, it was clear that they were now among the more prosperous families in the area. Willa watched Samuel grapple with his new role, supporting him through the difficult decisions and celebrating his successes. She also found her own role expanding, as the wife of the ranch owner had certain social obligations within the community. She joined the Ladies' Aid Society and began hosting occasional gatherings at their home, using the skills her mother had taught her years ago about being a gracious hostess. Despite their increased prosperity, Samuel and Willa were determined not to let it change who they were fundamentally. They continued to live modestly, investing most of the profits back into the ranch and setting aside money for the children's futures. They taught Rose, James, and Margaret the value of hard work and kindness, making sure the children understood that their good fortune came with responsibility to help those less fortunate. Rose, at 10, was old enough to understand the change in their circumstances, and Willa had several conversations with her about staying humble and treating everyone with respect, regardless of their station. Rose took these lessons to heart, remaining the same sweet, studious girl she had always been despite now being the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the county. As the years continued to pass, the Ashford family became a pillar of the Eagle Pass community. Samuel was respected for his fair dealings and his willingness to help neighbors in need. Willa was admired for her kindness and her skill at managing a large household. The children were well liked for their good manners and friendly natures. When Rose turned 16 in 1885, she had blossomed into a lovely young woman with multiple suitors showing interest. Samuel was protective, but tried not to be overbearing, trusting that he and Willa had raised Rose to make good decisions. Willa had long conversations with Rose about love and marriage, sharing the story of how she and Samuel had come together, and the work required to build a strong partnership. Rose eventually chose a young man named Daniel Porter, the son of a neighboring rancher, who was hardworking, respectful, and clearly besotted with her. Samuel gave his blessing, and the wedding was held in the spring of 1886, a joyous occasion that brought together the entire community. As Willa watched Rose exchange vows with Daniel, she thought about Martha and how proud she would have been of the woman her daughter had become. James, at 13, was already working alongside Samuel on the ranch, learning every aspect of the operation. He had his father's work ethic and leadership abilities, and it was clear that he would eventually take over management of the ranch when Samuel was ready to step back. Margaret, at 10, was showing an unexpected talent for numbers, and insisted on helping Willa keep the household accounts, demonstrating a quick mind for figures that both impressed and amused her parents. One evening in late 1886, as Willa and Samuel sat on their porch watching the sunset, Samuel reached over and took her hand, a gesture that had become so familiar over the years that Willa barely registered it except as a source of comfort. "We have come a long way from that little adobe house," Samuel observed, his voice reflective. "We have," Willa agreed. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed, how much we have built together. Do you remember what I said to you that first night? When I asked you to raise Rose with me," Samuel turned to look at her, his eyes warm with love. "You said we could be partners, that you could provide for us, that you wanted to give Rose a real home." Willa smiled at the memory. I thought you were crazy, proposing to a woman you barely knew." "Maybe I was a little crazy," Samuel admitted with a grin. "But it was the best decision I ever made. You have given me everything I never knew I wanted. A family, a purpose, a reason to be better than I was." "You have given me the same," Willa said softly. "That morning when Martha died, I thought my life was over. I thought I would end up losing everything, that Rose would be taken away and I would be alone again. I never imagined that within a day I would meet the man I would spend my life with, that I would find a love I did not even know was possible." Samuel lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I loved you from almost the first moment. The way you held Rose so protectively, the determination in your eyes when you said you would find a way to keep her. I knew right then that you were someone special, someone worth building a life with." "I did not fall in love with you quite that quickly," Willa admitted with a laugh. "But somewhere in those first few weeks, I realized that you were unlike any man I had ever met, that you were kind and honest and good, and that I wanted to spend my life with you. And here we are, almost 13 years later with 3 children and a ranch and a lifetime of memories already behind us." Samuel pulled her closer, and Willa rested her head on his shoulder. "And hopefully a lifetime more ahead of us," Willa added. "I want to grow old with you, Samuel. I want to see our grandchildren, watch James and Margaret build their own lives, enjoy the fruits of everything we have worked for together." "That sounds perfect to me," Samuel murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened, and the stars began to emerge, 2 people who had found each other through tragedy and built something beautiful from the ashes of loss. Their love story had not started in the typical way, but it had grown into something deep and lasting, a partnership built on respect, trust, and genuine affection that had only strengthened over the years. Inside the house, they could hear Margaret practicing her piano lessons, the notes slightly uncertain but improving with each repetition. James was in his room, probably reading one of the agricultural journals he had become interested in lately. Rose was at her own home now with Daniel, but she visited often, and Willa knew she would see her daughter again in a few days. This was their life, the life they had built together from that impossible beginning. It was not always easy, and there were still challenges and difficulties to navigate, but it was theirs, and it was good. Willa thought about the frightened young woman she had been, standing in Martha's room with a crying baby in her arms and no idea how she would manage. She thought about the cowboy who had walked into her life with an insane proposal and unwavering commitment, and she felt overwhelming gratitude for every twist of fate that had brought them to this moment. "Thank you," she said suddenly, lifting her head to look at Samuel. "For what?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly in confusion. "For that day. For seeing me and Rose and deciding we were worth changing your entire life for keeping every promise you made, for loving me even when I was not sure I was ready to be loved. For being the father Rose needed, and for giving me James and Margaret, for building this life with me." Willa's voice was thick with emotion. Samuel's eyes grew suspiciously bright, and he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "You do not ever need to thank me for loving you. Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done. You are my heart, Willa. You and our children, this family we have built together, that is everything to me." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, and full of the love they had nurtured over 13 years of marriage. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling, and Willa felt the same flutter of happiness in her chest that she had felt all those years ago when Samuel had first proposed his crazy plan. As autumn deepened into winter and the new year of 1887 approached, the Ashford family continued to thrive. Samuel and Willa celebrated their anniversary quietly, exchanging small gifts and reminiscing about their journey together. They took a rare day away from responsibilities to ride out to a spot by the creek where they sometimes went for privacy, and they talked about their dreams for the future. Samuel spoke about his hopes for the ranch, his plans for expanding certain operations, and his desire to eventually hand over a thriving enterprise to James. Willa shared her thoughts about Margaret's education, her concern that the small school in Eagle Pass might not be sufficient for their intelligent daughter, and her hope that they could send Margaret to a better school in San Antonio when she was older. They discussed Rose's happiness in her marriage and their anticipation of eventually becoming grandparents. "I hope we have many more years like this," Samuel said as they sat beside the creek, watching the water flow past. "Years of watching our children grow, of working side by side, of growing old together." "We will," Willa said with confidence. "We have built something strong, Samuel, something that will last," and she was right. The years continued to bring changes and challenges, but through it all, Willa and Samuel's love remained constant. Rose gave birth to twin girls in 1888, making Samuel and Willa grandparents for the first time, and the joy of holding those tiny babies and seeing their daughter embrace motherhood was profound. James showed increasing skill in ranch management and began courting a young woman from a nearby town, a sensible girl named Catherine who fit well into the family. Margaret continued to excel at everything she tried, eventually deciding she wanted to become a teacher, a goal that both surprised and delighted her parents. In 1892, on the 16th anniversary of their marriage, Willa and Samuel stood on their porch and looked out over the land they now owned, the home they had built, and the family they had created together. Rose was visiting with Daniel and their 3 children, the twins and a baby boy. James had brought Catherine to dinner, and there was talk of a wedding in the spring. Margaret was home from the academy in San Antonio, where she had been studying for the past year, full of stories about her experiences and her plans for the future. "Did you ever imagine this?" Willa asked Samuel, gesturing to the house full of people and love and laughter. "When you walked into my room that night with your crazy proposal, I imagined something," Samuel admitted, "but the reality is so much better than anything I could have dreamed up. We did this, Willa. We took a tragedy and created something beautiful from it." "We did," Willa agreed, leaning into his embrace. "And I would do it all again every single day if it meant ending up here with you." Samuel kissed her forehead, his arms tightening around her. "I love you, Willa Ashford. I have loved you from the beginning, and I will love you until the end. And I love you, Samuel Ashford, always and forever." Willa tilted her face up for a proper kiss, and Samuel obliged, their love as strong and true as it had been from the start. Inside, they could hear their children and grandchildren, the noise and chaos of a large family gathering, and it was the most beautiful sound in the world. They had started with tragedy, with a dying neighbor's baby and a cowboy's unlikely proposal, and they had built an entire world together. A world filled with love, laughter, hard work, and unwavering commitment to each other and to the family they had created. This was their happily ever after, not perfect but real, not easy but worth every struggle. They had found each other against all odds, and they had chosen each other every single day since. And as they stood together watching the sun set over their land, surrounded by the evidence of their love and their life together, both Willa and Samuel knew with absolute certainty that they had been blessed beyond measure. They had taken a moment of darkness and turned it into a lifetime of light, and that was the greatest achievement either of them could imagine. The years that followed brought more grandchildren, first from Rose and then from James after he married Catherine in a beautiful spring ceremony. Margaret eventually married a teacher she met during her training, a kind man who supported her passion for education and her desire to open a school for girls in Eagle Pass. Samuel and Willa watched their children build their own families with pride and joy, always available to offer advice or support, but careful not to interfere. As Samuel moved into his 60s and Willa approached her 50th birthday, they began to slowly step back from the daily operations of the ranch, allowing James to take on more responsibility. Samuel remained involved in major decisions, but he was content to let his son manage the day-to-day work. This gave Samuel and Willa more time to enjoy each other's company, to travel occasionally, and to spend time with their growing brood of grandchildren. They would often reflect on their journey together, marveling at how a single moment of compassion and courage had changed the trajectory of both their lives. Rose, now a mother of 4 and firmly established in her own household, would sometimes ask Willa about Martha, wanting to know more about the woman who had given her life. Willa would share stories about Martha's bravery, her love for Rose, and her determination to survive long enough to bring her daughter safely into the world. She would show Rose the gold locket that had been Martha's only possession of value, and Rose would hold it carefully, tears in her eyes as she thought about the mother she had never known. "She gave me life," Rose said once, "but you and Papa gave me a family. You gave me everything that matters." "Your mother wanted that for you," Willa assured her. "She wanted you to be loved and cared for, to have opportunities and happiness. Everything we did to honor her wishes and her memory." Rose had inherited some of her mother's delicate features, and as she matured, the resemblance became even more pronounced. But her personality, her values, her approach to life, those were products of being raised by Willa and Samuel, of growing up in a household where love was abundant and support was unconditional. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century dawned, the Ashford family had become a true dynasty in Eagle Pass. The ranch was one of the most successful in the region. James was proving to be an even more capable manager than Samuel had been, and the next generation was already showing signs of continuing the family legacy. Samuel and Willa, now in their 60s, had the luxury of spending their days as they pleased. They often sat together reading, or worked in the garden Willa had expanded over the years, or simply enjoyed watching the sunset from their porch, the same way they had done for decades. Their love had only deepened with time, the passion of their early years mellowing into a profound companionship and understanding. "I have been thinking," Samuel said one evening as they sat together, "about that day I came to your room. About how terrified I was that you would refuse, that I would not be able to help you and Rose. Were you really terrified? You seemed so calm and confident." Willa looked at him in surprise. "I was a mess inside," Samuel admitted with a laugh. "I had no idea what I was doing, proposing to a woman I barely knew, offering to raise a child that was not mine. It went against everything I had been taught about being practical and cautious. But something inside me knew it was the right thing to do, that you and Rose needed me and I needed you, even if I did not fully understand it yet." "I was terrified too," Willa confessed. "I kept thinking that you would change your mind, or that it would turn out to be some kind of trick, or that somehow it would all fall apart. I could not quite believe that someone would actually want to help me without expecting something terrible in return. And now here we are, over 25 years later, with a family and a life that exceeded both our expectations." Samuel reached for her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "Here we are," Willa echoed, squeezing back. Still together, still in love, still grateful for that crazy day that changed everything. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had weathered decades of life together and emerged stronger for it. Their love story had started in the most unlikely way, born from tragedy and desperation, but it had grown into something beautiful and lasting. They had raised children who were now raising children of their own, had built a legacy that would continue long after they were gone, and had created a partnership that was the envy of many who knew them. As the sun set over the Texas landscape they had called home for so long, Willa and Samuel reflected on the fullness of their life together. They had experienced joy and sorrow, success and struggle, moments of doubt and moments of absolute certainty. Through it all, they had chosen each other, supported each other, and loved each other with a constancy that was remarkable in its simplicity. "Thank you for taking a chance on me," Willa said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Thank you for saying yes," Samuel replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "Thank you for trusting me, for building this life with me, for loving me even when I did not deserve it." "You always deserved it," Willa said firmly. "From that very first day, you were exactly the man I needed, even if I did not know it yet." They remained on the porch long after darkness fell, reluctant to go inside and end the perfect moment. Around them, the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night created a familiar symphony, and in the distance, they could see lights from the houses where their children lived with their families. This was their legacy, this network of love and connection that had all begun with a dying neighbor's baby and a cowboy who had said, "Let's raise this child together." And what a life they had raised together. Not just Rose, though she would always be special as the child who had brought them together, but James and Margaret as well, and now a growing number of grandchildren who carried forward the values and love that Willa and Samuel had worked so hard to instill. The tragedy that had initiated their union had been transformed into something beautiful, something that would endure for generations. As they finally stood to go inside, Samuel wrapped his arm around Willa's waist, and she leaned into him, still perfectly comfortable in his embrace after all these years. They walked together into their home, into the life they had built together, knowing that whatever time remained to them would be spent exactly as they had spent the past decades, side by side, heart to heart, completely and utterly devoted to each other, and to the family they had created from an impossible beginning. Their story had started with death and desperation, but it had become a testament to the power of love, courage, and commitment, and that was the greatest legacy anyone could hope to leave behind.